what's on the mind of Xi Jinping right now is whether or not people are going to use different versions of history as a weapon against him.
Today, there was only one thing that people inside China and those following Chinese politics were talking about, and that is the death of a former Chinese premier. Zhu Rongji died at the age of 97. In the 90s, Zhu was the main man who drove China's economic reforms aside from Deng Xiaoping, including joining the WTO, and helped to turn China into the economic juggernaut that we fear and some love today. His death has triggered a lot of reflection inside and outside of China. In many ways, he was and is an emblem of a more liberal, optimistic and open China. To talk about Zhu, I'm joined by Professor Joseph Torregian, who's a Senior Fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a biographer of Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping, another reformer of that period. Joseph, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can you explain why we in Britain or in the West should care about Zhu Rongji?
So Zhu Rongji is widely viewed within China as one of the titans of the reform and opening period. He died just a few days before the 100th anniversary of the birth of Jiang Zemin, who was the general secretary when Zhu Rongji was premier. So this is a moment of reflection, I think, for many Chinese people about what that moment meant and what it means in terms of possibilities and differences in the long trajectory of Chinese history.
And just give us some examples of the policies that he brought into place.
Most famously, he was the person who negotiated China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And that was a fraught process. The United States asked a lot from China, and it was very hard for the Chinese to agree to a lot of what they ultimately came to do. And the reason that was possible was because of the forceful role of Zhu Rongji.
And there's some sense of history now, actually, which is perhaps ahistorical, that actually China was never going to liberalise properly. It was always a bit of a ploy to open up enough to benefit. Do you think people like Zhu Rongji really saw it that way, or did he really want to have the direction of travel to go further than what we have seen since?
That's a wonderful question. When we look at Chinese history, we often have these ideas about people as a true reformer, as a true liberalizer, as one of the good guys, so to speak. But when we look more carefully at the story of Zhu Rongji, we see that he certainly did deserve many of the credentials that he claims as a reformer, but he was also a complicated person. And the reason for that is he was still a member of the Chinese Communist Party. And so even though he created more space for the market, he still was a statist. He wanted to make the state more efficient, but never fully giving up control over the economy. And that, I think, was one of the reasons why it was so easy for someone like Xi Jinping to come around later and put even more resources back into the state.
And his reforms could be quite brutal in some ways, more brutal than perhaps democracy could take out, because his economic reforms led to mass layoffs. Tens of millions of people lost their jobs.
Zhu Rongji was at heart a party person, and when he thought that the party should take steps that would mean sacrifice for many people, including the tens of millions of people who lost their jobs, he thought it was worth it, and he believed that people would do it. And the reason for that was he, like other members of this organization, believed that it's stronger, more powerful, more efficient than Western democracies, precisely because they can make those hard decisions. But as you said, because they can make those decisions, it often does mean that a lot of people have to suffer for it.
I mean, it's interesting because the other thing that he's, I think, quite different from Chinese leaders today is that he's quite candid in some of the interviews. You know, he uses quite colourful language in a way that Jiang Zemin also used to do. And he will have these kind of ad hoc contributions to the media. And Hong Kong journalists in particular remember him being in conversation with them in a more candid way. You don't really get that kind of candidness from, excuse me, you don't really get that kind of candidness from Xi Jinping anymore these days.
You're absolutely right. Zhu Rongji was funny. He could give speeches in English. He was engaging. He talked to reporters. But even so, there was another side to him. When people within the party were critical, he would often tell them to shut up and to put the big picture first. Even as he told people underneath him to put up with him, he had a famously bad temper. He still was someone who was able to have a strong relationship with his boss, Jiang Zemin, because he was a party person and understood organizational discipline. And so this was still a system, right, where even the most open people were constrained by this need to do what the organization needed of them.
Do you buy this narrative of him as being what we call in Chinese a qingguan, one official who is not corrupt, given Jiang Zemin is probably also very, very corrupt?
So it's hard for people like us on the outside to say for sure. But for example, if you look at the diaries of Li Rui, who was a secretary to Mao Zedong, they're now available at Stanford University. The reputation that he had was a very good one, at least with regards to his own personal behavior. And in the 1990s, he talked a big game about fighting corruption. He had a very famous statement that 100 coffins should be prepared, 99 for corrupt individuals and one for him, meaning that it was going to be a bloody process, right? But nevertheless, people within China still look at the 1990s during his moment of leadership as one where materialism and consumerism came to dominate and corruption really got out of control despite people like him. And so Xi Jinping, I think, believes that reform and opening was unambiguously the right decision, but nevertheless, it did create problems like that, these centrifugal forces of the party losing its struggle mindset that he feels the need to correct.
And your latest book focuses on another reform figure of that era, as I mentioned earlier, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun. How similar or different was he of a school of politicians, Zhu Rongji, for example?
As I was saying before, we have these ideas of people within the leadership as the reformers, the liberals, the pro-Westerners, and that they were the sort of good guys and they were always fighting these evil radicals or conservatives within the party. But again, both of them were complicated. And so Xi Jinping's own father, he was a leading figure in the creation of the special economic zones, but nevertheless, he was very strongly opposed to giving more rights to peasants, which was really the main reason for the economic takeoff in the 1980s. So all of these people are complicated, but it's a spectrum, right? And as complicated as they are, they're limited in what they can do because of their needs to do what the top leader tells them to do. And there's this idea that you need to have someone who can make decisions and everyone puts up with them no matter how unhappy they are. And so Xi Jinping is somebody who has inherited that tradition, and he's somebody who gets to make the decisions. And so to the extent that there are different voices within the party, it's very hard for them to come to the top because especially now it's hard for them to figure out what's safe and what's not to say.
And that reputation of him as a reformer, that's been quite prevalent in the tributes that have been pouring in today, both inside China and outside of China. But do you think that actually from Zhu to Xi now, there's actually less of a difference and more of a continuation of the absolute power of the party and economic reforms where it suits them?
I think that people in the leadership right now in Beijing are concerned that people will take the death of Zhu Rongji and the centenary of Jiang Zemin's birth to reject what Xi Jinping is doing as giving up on this possibility of China in the 1990s and the 2000s when it really seemed like it was moving in a more liberal direction, a more market-oriented direction. And so we can talk about what the historical truth is in terms of continuities and discontinuities, but I think probably what's on the mind of Xi Jinping right now is whether or not people are going to use different versions of history as a weapon against him. And this is someone who really believes that the party to survive needs people to believe in its mission. And so as soon as you start talking about different paths that could have been taken, especially in a way of saying that he's taking the wrong path, that can be very sensitive. So it'll be interesting to see what people within China and outside of China do with this moment. Now, I don't suspect that there's going to be a revolution or anything like that, but because Xi Jinping is so security conscious, this is almost certainly something that they're keeping an eye on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we know that political deaths have a way of getting pretty overblown in China as an outlet for other disgruntlements, as we've seen in the last century. And in fact, the Tiananmen Square protest, that's how it all started. Joseph Torigian, thank you so much for joining us. That was Joseph Torigian, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.